All right. So, JCal, like you said, they added 6 new members: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. This on top of the original 5 members. Now, you've described this group of countries as mid. I don't know what metric you're using to make that determination. If you look at share of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms, and we can debate whether that's the right method or not, but a lot of economists believe that PPP is the right way to look at it. The original BRICS were 32% of global GDP. The new BRICS bring it to 37%. And there's a couple dozen more countries that have expressed an interest in joining BRICS, which would bring it to 45. The G7 is only 30%. And that number has been declining over time. Back in 1995, it was all the way at 45%, whereas the BRICS were only about 17%. You can see that decline or shift here in this chart, going all the way back to the 1980s. This is why I think a lot of Americans have this casually dismissive attitude towards the BRICS, is they're thinking that these countries are still living in the era of the 1990s of unipolarity, when the G7 was, more than half of global GDP. But now the BRICS are bigger than the G7. Again, in terms of PPP, the rest have risen and it's become a very substantial part of the world economy. If you look at global oil production, the new BRICS now have 54% of global oil production. It's almost double what the G7 produces, despite the U.S. still being the number one producer of oil. We're not the biggest exporter because we use it all. The U.S. is already roughly energy independent. We produce about 20 million barrels of oil a day, and we consume about 20 million. So we are roughly neutral with respect to the world. We're neither a net importer or net exporter as of now. So oil is still going to be it's the number one global commodity. If BRICS adds Venezuela, Algeria, and Kazakhstan, as they may do as soon as next year, they'll control 90% of all oil and gas traded globally. You're going to have an OPEC plus BRICS sort of symbiosis, because Russia and Saudi Arabia basically run OPEC plus. New BRICS is also really strong in food production. 5 of the world's 6 biggest food producers are now part of BRICS: China, Brazil, India, Argentina, and Russia. The only other one is the US. They have 46% of global population, 36% of global land mass. So my point is, BRICS isn't just strong in global GDP, they're strong in the production of what are currently the 2 most important commodities in the world, which is oil and food. They also have influence over strategic trade routes. So if you look at where these countries are located, and I'm sure this went into the thinking of who they just admitted to BRICS, because they had a lot of choices. They had something like 26 countries applied, and these are the first 6 they've added. So they now control the Arctic Sea route, which is basically as the polar ice cap starts to melt in the Arctic, you're seeing a new ability to create maritime routes north of Russia, basically, from Europe to Asia. It's a much faster route than going around the Horn of Africa or through the Suez Canal. You have this international north-south transportation corridor, which is basically a combination of overland routes and some maritime that connect Russia, Iran, and India. You've got Belt and Road, these east-west corridors. You've got the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal. They're all now part of BRICS. And the point of that, I think, strategically, is to bypass choke points like the Strait of Singapore, the Strait of Malacca, the Bosphorus, and the Strait of Hormuz. So the point here is that the U.S. Navy has very strategically over decades been encircling China with military bases on, island chains around China. This is going to basically neutralize that whole strategy, because China will have ways of securing its trade routes over land or, again, over sea going through the Arctic. So this has huge geostrategic implications. The other big thing that I think BRICS is doing is they have this 5 to 10 year goal of allowing BRICS members to settle trades in local currencies. I think that you guys may be seeing it the wrong way. The goal here is not to create a new reserve currency. It's simply to create a way to bypass the dollar complex. They're trying to break the petrodollar monopoly. This is not an offensive organization, and they're not necessarily trying to create a single alternative to the US dollar. They are trying to create a way to not have to go through the dollar complex in order to do their trade when they're trading with each other. And
they would like
what China and Brazil are doing is a test case for this, where they are setting up a yuan clearing arrangement with Brazil.
And the goal, to be clear, Sacks, here is to have a voice versus the G7, which they feel a lot of these countries feel they've been left out of, and to maybe not have as much dependency on the West and form this bloc that has a bigger voice in the world, right?
Yeah,
that is
I would go a little further.
Goal.
I go a little further and say this isn't just about them having a voice. It's about them having economic sovereignty. They do not want to be completely dependent on the United States to secure their economies. And the big driver of this has been the weaponization of the US dollar.
And SWIFT. Yeah. What we did to Russia with SWIFT, yes.
So in conjunction with this Ukraine war, the US seized Russia's foreign reserves, which were in dollars. They've widely imposed sanctions. We're now sanctioning dozens and dozens of countries, and we are tactically limiting who can use SWIFT as part of this. So if you are any of the BRICS countries, you're asking yourself, wait a second, when I am doing business with another member of BRICS, why should the US be any part of that transaction?
Yeah,
they do not want that transaction to be mediated by the US at all.
In a way, it's like people buying crypto so that they don't have to deal with the US government. They have they have Bitcoin over here and they're not subject to the rules of the US dollar, right? It's like a way of opting out and having some independence. Yeah, I totally get it.
They're willing to play by the US's rules when they're trading with the US, but they do not want to have to play by the US's rules when they're not trading with the US or the G7. And this is about creating that independence. It's true that BRICS does not have an impressive record of accomplishment to date. That's simply true. However, recent events, I think, have provided the motivation for this group of countries to now try and get something done. In the past, it was just so phenomenally convenient to be based on the US dollar complex because everything's priced in dollars, easy to transact in dollars. And when you run a trade surplus, the US has an open capital account and you can just park the money in US treasuries. So there was never a reason for any of these countries to want to leave the US dollar complex until more recently, when again, US foreign policy has militarized and weaponized the dollar and to try and make it a coercive instrument to get these countries to do what the US wants. And all those countries now are bristling at that and they want to maintain their sovereignty. And so now they have tremendous motivation to get this done. Now, the thing they've already agreed to and done as part of BRICS is that when you join BRICS, you agree not to sanction any other member of BRICS. That is a meaningful commitment. And obviously, it has a lot to do with this Ukraine war and the fact the U.S. has been demanding that the whole world sanction Russia. And most of the world has not been sanctioning Russia. And that's why the sanctions have not been effective, is the U.S. has not been able to get that done. The U.S. will not be able to get it done in the future with respect to at least the countries who are members of BRICS with regard to their trade with each other. And as we saw in the percentage of world GDP, BRICS very rapidly, once they add a few more members, are going to be at about 50% of world GDP. So the U.S. is only going to be able to influence, call it roughly that half, a global GDP, where the U.S. or the G7 is a major trading partner. Now, what BRICS will be lacking is the way on a technical level to bring about the sovereignty they want. So they need to have a way to settle and clear transactions, and they need to have a place to park the surplus that's created for net exporters. And they haven't quite figured that out yet. So, for example, there's a recent news item where Russia, which is selling a huge amount of oil to India right now, it was saying that they don't want to accumulate more rupees. So they've got to figure out, well, what do we do with all these extra rupees? So there's a lot of pieces to figure out here. And that is why they're saying this is a goal they have over the next 5 to 10 years. It's not 1 to 2 year time frame, it's 5 to 10 years. But
let them they should make their own euro. If they feel so strongly that they're a great voting bloc, make a euro. And then they could all put into it. And you can see what happens when a bunch of dictators and a long tail of failed states now share a common currency. It's not going to work. These countries are all at each other.
Yeah, failed states who share
Egypt,
GDP
Ethiopia,
has been
these
going
ones
up like
are
a
all
rocket.
very troubled states, by the way. Yeah, I mean,
their share of GDP has been going up like a rocket, J. Cal. That's the whole point.
Inflation.
Now, furthermore, their goal, we have to be
democracy,
really clear.
Human rights. Yeah,
their goal is not to create a common currency like the euro. China
I'm just saying,
and India and Brazil are not going to replace yuan and rupees with some sort of new euro-like currency. Moreover, they're not trying to create a reserve currency that's going to be a currency for the man on the street. This is about settlement of global trade flows and getting out from under the US dollar complex.